She said I couldn't leave until I finished the lesson, but I never expected what I'd learn about her, and myself. The classroom was unusually quiet that late afternoon. Golden sunlight slanted through the tall windows, dust motes floating lazily in the air, giving the room a warm, almost magical glow. The familiar scent of chalk mixed subtly with the faint aroma of coffee lingering from her mug on the corner of the desk. I had stayed behind for extra tutoring, expecting a few quick corrections and then the usual, polite dismissal. Instead, she surprised me. Her voice, calm yet commanding, broke the silence. "You're not leaving until you finish this lesson." I froze, my pen hovering above the notebook. There was a light firmness in her tone that didn't just suggest authority, it demanded attention, invited focus. At first, I felt a flicker of panic, but it quickly softened into curiosity. There was something in the way she said it, a subtle playfulness beneath the seriousness, that made my chest tighten in an unexpected way. She was leaning slightly against her desk, one hand resting lightly on the polished wood, the other tucked casually into her pocket. The movement was graceful, almost effortless, yet carried a quiet authority. Her hair, the deep brown streaked with strands of silver, caught the sunlight as she tilted her head, brushing a loose strand behind her ear. That small, ordinary gesture seemed charged, intimate in a way that made me acutely aware of every detail, the curve of her smile, the gentle way her eyes softened when she looked at me. As I shuffled my notes and tried to focus, I realized the room felt smaller, the air thicker, as if her presence itself was somehow altering the space. Every slight movement she made, the way she adjusted the papers, the subtle shift of her weight, the faint rustle of her blouse, became impossible to ignore. My mind kept wandering to the warmth radiating from her, the faint perfume that seemed to linger near her desk, and the quiet steadiness of her gaze that held me, almost daring me to break focus. I tried to concentrate on the lesson, scribbling down answers, checking formulas, but the words felt secondary to the tension growing quietly between us. It wasn't just the content of the lesson, it was her attention, the way she leaned over the desk to correct a mistake, the soft brush of her sleeve against my arm. Each touch, however fleeting, sent a spark of awareness through me. In that moment, I understood something unspoken. This was more than just a lesson in schoolwork. It was a lesson in presence, in noticing the subtleties of someone who carried both authority and vulnerability, confidence and quiet warmth. And somehow, without realizing it, I wanted to stay. Not because I needed the tutoring, but because I didn't want to leave the space where her attention lingered, where her small gestures seemed to speak directly to me. The sunlight shifted slightly, casting elongated shadows across the wooden floor, and I knew I was caught, not by obligation, but by something far more unexpected, the magnetic pull of her presence. The lesson hadn't even begun yet, but I could already feel that it was going to change something, quietly, profoundly, in ways I couldn't yet name. The afternoon sun had begun its slow descent, spilling warm, golden light across the classroom floor. I moved closer to her desk, carrying my notebook and pencils, trying to position myself so I could focus on the lesson without feeling awkward. But the space between us was charged with something I couldn't name, a quiet, magnetic tension that made even the simple act of sitting down feel significant. She looked up as I settled into the chair beside her, her eyes holding that same mixture of authority and gentle curiosity that had caught me off guard the day before. There was a soft warmth in her gaze, as if she were studying more than my answers. She was noticing me, noticing the way I shifted in my seat, the slight hesitations in my movements. I felt my chest tighten. Every detail of her presence seemed amplified, the smooth fabric of her blouse, the faint scent of her perfume, the subtle warmth radiating from her, as she leaned slightly closer to point at a formula on my page. The lesson began properly this time, yet it felt secondary to the awareness that hummed in the air. Her hand brushed against mine as she passed the pencil, and though it was a fleeting touch, it lingered far longer in my mind. I caught myself imagining the softness of her fingers, the way her palm had grazed mine, and the warmth that had spread through my chest. My heart beat faster, but I forced myself to focus on the equations, the notes, anything to ground myself in the lesson and not in the pull she exerted so effortlessly. She leaned over my notebook to correct an error, the scent of her hair brushing my cheek as she did. My shoulder brushed hers, a brief, electric contact that sent a ripple of awareness down my spine. She straightened quickly, pretending nothing had happened, but the slight smile tugging at the corner of her lips told me otherwise. I tried to concentrate, tried to focus on the numbers and letters on the page, but every glance at her reminded me that I was acutely conscious of her nearness, of how her presence filled the small space between us. Her voice was calm, instructive, but softer than usual. When she explained a problem, her words felt almost like a gentle caress, each syllable measured and deliberate. I noticed the slight arch of her brow, the delicate way she tucked her hair behind her ear, and even the subtle tilt of her head when she leaned closer to check my work. These were ordinary gestures, yet in this quiet, sunlit classroom, they felt charged with meaning, intimate in a way that made me acutely aware of the boundary we were skirting, professional, yet undeniably personal. The room felt smaller, the air warmer, as if her presence had compressed space itself. Every small motion she made, from adjusting the papers on my desk to the soft brush of her hand against mine, made me acutely conscious of her nearness. And despite the tension, despite the forbidden awareness that lingered, I found myself leaning in slightly, wanting to catch every detail, every glance, every quiet moment that passed between us. By the time the lesson was halfway through, I realized I wasn't just learning equations or formulas. I was learning about her, her patience, her grace, the subtle power she wielded without raising her voice. And more than anything, I was learning how easily one could become captivated by someone who seemed so completely in command, yet effortlessly human in her kindness. By now, the lesson had settled into a quiet rhythm, and the words themselves became almost secondary. We no longer spoke as much. Instead, the silence between us carried its own weight, filled with small gestures and fleeting glances. She leaned over my notebook to check my work, her presence so close that I could feel the warmth radiating from her, subtle and comforting, like sunlight on my skin. Our eyes met often, sometimes by accident, sometimes as if we were drawn together by something unspoken. In those moments, I noticed the details I had never truly seen before. The delicate curve of her lips when she paused, the soft line of her neck when she tilted her head to read my notes, the way her fingers rested lightly on the desk, poised but relaxed. Each observation made my chest tighten, a quiet awareness of her that was impossible to ignore. There was a moment when she reached for a pen, and our hands almost touched. Just for an instant, our fingers brushed, and the sensation lingered far longer than it should have. It was electric but gentle. A spark without flame, intimate but proper. My mind struggled to focus on the equations, yet I couldn't stop noticing her, the subtle warmth of her skin, the faint scent of her perfume, the soft rustle of her blouse as she shifted. She paused mid-sentence, her gaze lingering on me with a quiet intensity that made my thoughts falter. I realized that she was not just correcting my mistakes or guiding me through the lesson. She was noticing me in a way that went beyond teacher and student. There was a depth there, a curiosity that mirrored my own. I felt exposed and understood all at once, the sort of vulnerable awareness that makes the heart beat a little faster. Time seemed to stretch in that space. Each small gesture, a shift of her weight, a gentle nod, the way her hand rested near mine on the desk, felt laden with meaning. I became hyper-aware of my own movements, careful not to overstep, yet secretly craving those fleeting touches. There was a rhythm developing between us, silent and delicate, where every glance and every pause communicated more than words ever could. At one point, she smiled softly, just a small curve of her lips, and it felt like a quiet invitation, a reassurance that whatever tension existed between us was welcome, even if unspoken. I returned the smile, hesitant, aware of the boundaries we were skirting, yet unable to ignore the warmth that spread through me. Even the classroom seemed to fade around us. The hum of the radiator, the slant of sunlight across the floor, the quiet ticking of the wall clock, all became background to the subtle dance of proximity and attention that existed between us. I was learning more than algebra or formulas. I was learning how to read the spaces between words, how to notice the unspoken, how a single glance could carry more meaning than any explanation. By the time we returned our focus to the lesson, I realized something quietly profound. I was no longer just his teacher and student, and I was no longer just learning or teaching. We were learning each other, slowly, delicately, with every fleeting moment that passed between words. The afternoon had softened into early evening, and the sunlight now spilled through the classroom windows in gentle, amber streaks. I was hunched over my notebook, pencil scratching across the page, trying to focus on the problem she had assigned. Yet every time I glanced up, she seemed to be watching me, her eyes warm, attentive, and just slightly amused, like she was holding back a secret. It started with a small comment. I had made a minor mistake in one of my calculations, and she leaned over my shoulder, pointing at the page with the tip of her pen. Her body was close enough that I could feel the warmth of her arm near mine. She smiled softly, that subtle curve of her lips that seemed effortless but somehow filled the room with a quiet energy. "Oh, you missed this one," she said, her voice gentle but teasing, a playful lilt threading through the words. "Do you want me to show you again, or are you brave enough to figure it out yourself?" I chuckled nervously, aware of how close she was. The pencil in her hand brushed against mine as she gestured toward the mistake, and my chest tightened. It was such a fleeting touch, so ordinary in isolation, yet in the context of the moment, it felt intimate, charged. My mind flitted between focusing on the lesson and being acutely aware of her presence. She leaned a little closer, tilting her head as she watched me work. The sunlight caught the silver strands in her hair, and the soft sway of her posture made her seem both composed and effortless. I could see the faint warmth in her eyes as she observed me, and I caught myself smiling back, embarrassed by how easily her attention had made me self-conscious. Her teasing continued, but it was gentle, a rhythm that felt almost like a game. "Careful, your numbers are wandering again," she said, her voice playful, her finger lightly tapping the page near mine. Each small gesture, the brush of her hand, the tilt of her head, the soft smile, was like a quiet invitation to step closer emotionally, even as I struggled to maintain focus. The physical proximity between us was undeniable. Our shoulders brushed lightly as she leaned over to inspect my work, and for a moment, I was aware of the heat radiating from her. Even the smallest movements, a shift of weight, the casual adjustment of her sleeve, felt like a deliberate message I was only beginning to understand. I wanted to linger in these moments, to stretch them out, yet I was painfully aware of the boundaries that separated us. And then she laughed softly at one of my hesitant answers, a sound so warm and genuine that I felt my tension melt just a little. Her hand rested momentarily near mine on the desk, and though nothing more happened, I sensed an unspoken acknowledgement of the connection growing between us. It wasn't just the lesson anymore. It was the shared space, the subtle dance of gestures and glances, the playful tension that had quietly become the heartbeat of the room. By the end of the lesson, I realized that the teasing had done more than highlight mistakes. It had drawn me closer to her, made me notice her in ways I hadn't before. I was no longer just a student doing homework. I was a young man captivated by the presence of a woman who seemed impossibly poised, yet approachable, confident yet quietly vulnerable. And in that slow, teasing rhythm, the emotional current between us had grown stronger, unspoken but undeniably real. The evening light had dimmed to a soft, honeyed glow as shadows stretched across the classroom. I had been working on the lesson for what felt like hours, and despite my best efforts, the numbers on the page refused to make sense. My pencil hovered, hovering, and finally, in a rare moment of defeat, I sighed and pushed the notebook away. I just can't get this, I admitted quietly, my voice tinged with frustration. My gaze dropped to the desk, but I felt her presence immediately, quiet, steady, attentive. She leaned closer, not in judgment, but with a warmth that made my chest tighten. Her hand brushed lightly against my forearm, the touch so gentle that it felt almost accidental, yet deliberate enough to hold my attention. My frustration melted into something more complicated: comfort, awareness, and a flutter of something I didn't fully understand. "It's okay," she said softly, her voice low and reassuring. She rested her other hand near mine on the desk, the space between our palms so small it made my heart beat faster. "We all get stuck sometimes. The important thing is that you're trying." Her words, simple as they were, felt like a lifeline. I swallowed, feeling the tension in my shoulders ease slightly as I met her gaze. Her eyes held something I hadn't noticed before, a quiet understanding, a patient attentiveness that made me feel seen. I realized then that this lesson had become more than equations or formulas. It had become a space where my mistakes, my struggles, could exist without judgment. I tried to focus on the work again, but her presence made it impossible to ignore the emotional undercurrent flowing between us. Each movement she made, the soft adjustment of her sleeve, the way she leaned in to check my work, the gentle tilt of her head when she explained something, felt charged with subtle intimacy. Her closeness was comforting, yet it sparked a heightened awareness of her, of the warmth she radiated, and the quiet power in the way she observed me. I feel like I'm failing," I admitted, my voice quieter this time, tinged with vulnerability. The words surprised even me. It wasn't just about the lesson, it was the fear of not measuring up, of disappointing someone whose opinion mattered far more than it should. She reached out, placing her hand lightly on my forearm again, this time letting her thumb brush slowly over my skin. It was a small gesture, almost invisible, but it carried reassurance, empathy, and a subtle sense of connection. I looked up at her, caught in the steadiness of her gaze, and for the first time, I felt entirely unguarded in front of her. "Listen," she said softly, her voice close enough that I could feel her breath, warm and gentle. "You're not failing. You're learning. And sometimes, learning takes time, patience, and the right guidance." She smiled just slightly, a hint of playfulness mixed with sincerity. The combination was disarming, and I realized that my heart had shifted in ways I hadn't expected, an awareness of her presence, her care, her quiet influence. For the first time in the lesson, I felt grounded, not just in the work, but in the connection forming between us. I wanted to linger in that warmth, to remain close, to savor the subtle intimacy that had grown naturally from moments like this. The lesson had become more than a challenge, it had become a bridge between us, built on patience, understanding, and the quiet power of small, meaningful touches. By the time the lesson was nearing its end, the classroom had grown quiet in a different way, not the tense silence of concentration, but a gentle, shared calm that seemed to hum between us. The sunlight had faded to a soft, golden glow, casting long shadows across the desks. I had completed the exercises, my notebook filled with corrected formulas, yet neither of us moved immediately. We sat side by side, the small space between us charged with unspoken awareness. She shifted slightly, her chair brushing gently against mine, and I became conscious of the warmth radiating from her. Every subtle motion, how she leaned forward to pick up a pen, the tilt of her head as she studied my work, the soft exhale as she adjusted her posture, felt like deliberate signals, a quiet rhythm that drew me closer even as I struggled to articulate the feelings rising in my chest. "I can see you've really worked hard," she said softly, her voice warm but low, intimate in a way that made me glance up and meet her eyes. The steady gaze she held wasn't just observing, it was acknowledging me, my effort, and perhaps something deeper, something neither of us had yet named. I shifted in my seat, nervous, suddenly aware of how conscious I was of her nearness. Our hands almost touched as we both reached for the same pen, a fleeting contact that lingered longer in my mind than in reality. There was a spark in that simple, accidental touch, a quiet confirmation of the tension that had been building over days of shared lessons, subtle gestures, and unspoken understanding. We began talking about more than equations. Casual observations led to reflections, her thoughts on life, the way she had come to find patience in her work, the moments she found herself unexpectedly inspired. I shared small pieces of myself too, hesitantly at first, then more openly as I felt her quiet attentiveness encourage honesty. Each confession, each laugh, each pause brought us closer, a rhythm forming naturally, effortlessly. At one point, she leaned slightly closer, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear, and I noticed the faint warmth of her skin, the soft scent of her perfume lingering in the air. I felt an almost magnetic pull toward her, but it wasn't urgent or desperate. It was calm, steady, like sunlight touching the skin after a long winter. I wanted to stay in that space, to savor the quiet intimacy that had grown organically, unhurried and respectful. "I've enjoyed seeing your progress," she said, her voice softer now, carrying a tenderness that made my chest tighten. There was a pause, a shared acknowledgement, a wordless understanding that the boundary between teacher and student had not dissolved, yet something more profound had emerged: mutual recognition, connection, and the stirrings of emotion neither of us could fully name. The lesson had ended, but we lingered. I realized, in that gentle silence, that our bond had shifted. It wasn't about finishing homework anymore. It was about presence, awareness, and the quiet acknowledgement of feelings that had grown slowly, patiently, through subtle touches, shared laughter, and the soft weight of understanding. And in that moment I understood, this wasn't just a lesson in academics. It was a turning point in both our lives, a lesson in noticing, feeling, and allowing the heart to recognize what the mind had only begun to sense. By the time I finally stood, notebook in hand and pencil tucked behind my ear, the classroom had taken on a quiet, almost reverent calm. The golden sunlight had softened into the gentle amber of early evening, casting long, warm shadows across the floorboards. Every object, the desks, the chalkboard, the faintly worn rug by her desk, felt imbued with memory, with the subtle traces of hours we had spent together, side by side, learning and quietly noticing each other. She looked up at me, her expression calm but tender, and for a moment, the room felt smaller, almost intimate, as though we were the only two people in the world. Her eyes held a quiet warmth, a soft acknowledgement of the days and moments that had led us here. "You've done well," she said softly, and her voice carried more than praise. It carried recognition, understanding, and an unspoken connection that had been building gradually, patiently, between us. I felt the pull of the lingering closeness. I was aware of the warmth in her presence, the subtle fragrance of her perfume, and the gentle, steady rhythm of her breath as she spoke. There was a pause, and then, almost instinctively, she reached out, her hand resting lightly on my shoulder. The contact was brief, delicate, and entirely platonic, yet it conveyed everything words could not. The warmth of her palm, the steadiness of her touch, made me feel grounded and seen in a way that went beyond any lesson or academic success. "I thank you," I murmured, my voice low, almost shy, yet filled with gratitude for her guidance, and, more importantly, for the quiet intimacy we had shared. She offered a small, knowing smile in return, and the corners of her eyes crinkled softly, a gentle acknowledgement that we both understood the unspoken bond that had grown between us. I hesitated at the door, feeling the weight of the moment, the mix of longing and respect that had defined our time together. She remained by her desk, watching me with an almost imperceptible tilt of her head, her presence steady and reassuring. The quiet hum of the classroom, the soft scrape of chalk against the board, the faint creak of the chair as she shifted, became a background symphony to the emotions between us, the subtle energy of connection and mutual regard. I took a step forward, then paused, catching her gaze once more. It was an unspoken promise, a gentle understanding that what we had shared was meaningful, yet respectful. A quiet acknowledgement of what could be, and what already was, a bond formed through attention, care, and the slow, deliberate building of trust and intimacy. As I finally left the classroom, the warm glow of the setting sun followed me, casting a final golden light on the pages of my notebook, the faint echoes of her laughter, and the subtle warmth of her hand on my shoulder. The lesson had ended, but the experience, the slow unfolding of connection, the quiet intimacy, and the emotional resonance, would remain with me long after. It was a gentle, satisfying ending, a moment of warmth, understanding, and quiet affection. The story of our teacher-student bond had found its resolution, not in dramatic gestures, but in lingering looks, careful touches, and the realization that sometimes, the most profound connections are built in moments between words. If you felt the tension, the warmth, and the quiet moments between them, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more slow burn, age gap romance stories. Share your thoughts in the comments. Who was your favorite character, and which moment made your heart race the most? Hit the bell icon so you never miss a lesson in love like this one.